I'm Bill Keep.
Nancy Lasher. Welcome to Profit, Power, and Policy. We do the research and explore how laws, regulations, businesses, and big money in politics have worked to the detriment of consumers and citizens.
Hey, Nancy. The U.S., China, Germany, and South Korea each have globally competitive companies in a variety of industries. Major companies in all of these countries except South Korea have or are experiencing layoffs. And large South Korean companies are pursuing workforce reduction with quote-unquote voluntary retirement. As a skilled worker facing a potential layoff, would you prefer to be working for a company in the U.S., China, Germany, or South Korea?
Okay, Bill, it's really not a contest. I choose Germany.
Good choice. In this episode, we will explore the extent to which workers have more or fewer protections as companies in each of these countries adjust their workforce.
Before I explain why I chose Germany, Bill, let's first look at the other three countries.
Okay, let's start with South Korea, a thriving industrialized country with globally competitive products such as automobiles, electronics, and appliances. They have a skilled workforce and considerable worker protection laws for some workers, enforced by the courts, not negotiated with companies. That means if a company dismisses workers, like to replace them with robots, the court decides if there is a violation of the law. Although heavily unionized, this is not a system where the union and the company negotiate to resolve these matters. Instead, the courts decide.
Wait, Bill, that only applies to some workers. In fact, South Korea uses a tier labor system, and only regular workers enjoy those legal protections. About 40% of all workers are considered non-regular workers who do not enjoy those protections. Large corporations rely primarily on regular workers, but some non-regular workers as well as contract workers. The last type do not get the legal protections from layoffs. Unlike in the U.S., when unions were strong, improved wages for unionized workers also benefited non-unionized workers. In South Korea, the gains of unionized regular workers may come at the expense of non-regular workers. Non-regular workers have employment uncertainty, lower wages, are less likely to be covered by social insurance. In 2021, temporary employment constituted 26% of all employment in South Korea, more than twice the 11% average of OECD member countries.
So, non-regular workers provide a labor force buffer in South Korea, enjoying more jobs and better wages during good times and just the opposite during bad times. With one of the most highly educated workforces in the world, fewer than 2/3 of workers are regular and benefit from job protections. Recently, South Korea passed the Yellow Envelope Act, intended to close at least some of the employment protection gap between regular and non-regular workers and contract workers. The trick is trying to find a balance between driving up corporate labor expenses and tapping employment insurance for more payouts.
As you know, Bill, China is a massive country with over 810 million workers. Many are classified as migrant workers, not counting as regular workers. The same for so-called rural workers and the large number of self-employed or gig workers who also are not part of the regular workforce. Add these up, and we are looking at nearly half of all Chinese workers who don't qualify for unemployment protections. This looks much like South Korea. By the way, this also allows China to understate its unemployment rate. While officially at about 5%, most outside observers estimate China's unemployment rate to be closer to 10%. In both China and South Korea, some workers qualify for benefits similar to those in the U.S., but the percent who benefit vary greatly.
Okay, some workers in China do qualify for unemployment benefits. Like in the U.S., companies and employees each pay into an unemployment insurance fund. Unlike the U.S., the Chinese government actually pays companies to maintain their workforce by giving them refunds on their unemployment insurance if they keep layoffs low. When layoffs do occur, the worker has to meet strict eligibility requirements. For example, they must have been employed under a formal labor contract, paid into the unemployment insurance system for the entire prior year, and experienced an involuntary separation. Consequently, fewer than 15% of unemployed workers in China qualified for unemployment insurance, a far cry from the 40 to 70% in other developed countries.
So clearly, Bill, China is off the list. Now let's talk about why I don't want to be laid off in the United States. After teaching employment law for 30 years, I learned just how vulnerable U.S. workers can be. Recent layoff announcements make clear that U.S. workers have no voice and far fewer protections than in some countries, especially Germany. I will explain, so put your feet up and relax.
Nancy, first of all, anyone watching our YouTube channel doesn't want to see my feet up, and anyone listening on one of the non-video platforms can't see us. And remember, this is a partnership, so we both did the research, so I get to talk too.
You're right about that. I'll start. There are 3 ways to be employed in the U.S. The vast majority of workers, 74%, are employed at will. That means an employer can end your employment at any time for any legal reason. Examples of illegal reasons for terminating employment include race, gender, color, religion, national origin, pregnancy, and age discrimination. Other than these protections, an employer can end a worker's employment at will. And of course, an employee can leave his or her employment at any time if he or she is an employee at will. Of the remaining 26% of those employed, unions represent 11.2%, and everyone else has employment contracts.
When the percent of workers under union contracts peaked, the U.S. enjoyed a robust middle class. Now we have high income disparity, and unions represent a mere 11.2% of workers. You know, Nancy, I started paying into Social Security as a teenager, and between then and graduate school, I worked a variety of jobs, some unionized, some not. But I grew up in a union environment. My father was a Teamster, so was one of my brother-in-laws, another was United Auto Workers, and my uncle and cousin were both International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So I grew up around unions and witnessed the decline. I know some of it had to do with states adopting right-to-work laws. You're the expert, so what does right-to-work mean, and how has it hurt unionization?
Bill, in this sense, right to work means you can work in a unionized environment without being part of the union. The union represents you as a member of the bargaining unit, but you can opt out of paying dues for the privilege. As a former union president, we refer to that as the free rider problem. The law is designed to cause financial distress for unions. Currently in the United States, 10% of employees are dues-paying union members, with 11.2% of employees being represented by unions. That means 1.2% of employees benefit without paying union dues. When you are represented by a union, the rules of the collective bargaining agreement control your employment. And if you are a member of the bargaining unit, you cannot make your own separate deal.
The third way you can be employed in the United States is to work under an employment contract. The contract has a definite beginning and ending date. If your employment is wrongfully terminated during the contract period, your contract has been breached. Whether employed under a contract, part of a union, or employment at will, employers need flexibility to adjust their workforce in response to intense global competition and changing technology. And sometimes employers just plain overreach to the detriment of workers. From 2008 to 2015, the Fed had a near net zero interest rate policy. Corporations, this is almost free money, borrowing at no cost. That led some companies to invest in projects that they would not have invested in had the price of money been near normal. Projects that did not generate positive cash flow by the time interest rates began to climb began to hurt the bottom line. Consequently, employers started shedding workers, so layoffs can come from external competition, technological changes, and from failed management decisions. Upon being laid off, employees in the U.S. qualify for unemployment insurance, unlike what happens to many workers in South Korea and China. I had never collected unemployment benefits, but once I came very, very close. I registered for it, but thankfully got a job before I was to begin collecting an unemployment check. I know many others who have collected checks and were grateful to have them. At times, when economic conditions were particularly challenging, the federal government even extended unemployment benefits beyond the usual 26 weeks.
That's true as long as you are not self-employed, and as long as you've been employed for a specific length of time and did not voluntarily leave your job. You have to be actively looking for a job. Unemployment rules are state-specific. That means the length of time you have to have worked to qualify varies by state, and the amount you are paid during the period of your unemployment varies by state. And unemployment benefits last a maximum of 26 weeks in most states. Some states have a shorter period, and in one state, Massachusetts, the maximum is 30 weeks. Some workers find jobs before their unemployment benefits run out, but some don't. What's also important to remember from our last episode is that in the U.S., healthcare is often tied to employment, while many other countries provide healthcare via the government. So if you lose your job in the U.S., you lose your healthcare. Bill, the U.S. did pass a law that was supposed to address layoffs. The Worker Adjustment, Retraining, and Notification Act, known as the WARN Act, requires employers with 100 or more full-time employees to provide 60 days advance written notice of a plant closing or mass layoff. There are significant exceptions, unforeseen business circumstances, a faltering company where the employer is seeking capital or an investment and giving notice would have jeopardized the chance of receiving this, and a natural disaster. Unfortunately, the law is written to be site-specific or business unit-specific, which is not how many businesses work today.
Actually, Nancy, the Warren Act proved to be pretty worthless, and it has no enforcement arm. No federal agency has the power to investigate a company for violating the Warren Act. All cases are private cases. In other words, laid-off workers have to sue the company for violating the Warren Act. Naturally, that takes time and money out of the unemployed worker's pocket, with the only remedy being back pay and benefits. It is almost as if it was never really intended to be effective. The federal government literally has no role in making sure that companies comply. Of the available data, and there isn't much. In the early 2000s, only about 1/4 of plant closings were subject to Warrant Act notice requirements, and companies complied with giving notice in only about 1/3 of those cases. So it's pretty worthless.
Some states, such as New Jersey, have their own version of the WARN Act with stricter protections than the federal version. But at last count, only 13 states had those laws. I'm sure state chambers of commerce lobby heavily to prevent states from passing laws that offer those protections. Now let's talk about why I chose Germany as the country I'd most like to get laid off in if it had to happen. That's because it is very difficult to lay off employees in Germany. German corporations have something called codetermination, a second supervisory board that has half of its members from the ranks of employees. And the supervisory board must approve any restructuring. German corporations have two boards, a management board that runs the company and a supervisory board that monitors the management board. In fact, the union chief is deputy chairperson of the supervisory board. Employees have a real voice in Germany. Imagine publicly recognizing that the livelihood of workers and strength of businesses are interrelated to a point of recognizing the codetermination of their futures.
Yeah, for example, Volkswagen currently has a plan to cut production and shrink employment in Germany by 50,000. To reach this goal, the company had already planned with worker representatives a reduction of 35,000 achieved through attrition, retirement, and voluntary severance packages across VW's units, meaning VW, Porsche, Audi, etc. The union response was coordinated and effective. The company now plans to reduce its model lineup and cut its total production to 9 million vehicles annually. The plans would mean 15,000 more jobs lost in Germany and the possibility of closing 4 plants. There have been protests across 20 VW plants in support of workers. The state of Saxony holds a significant stake in the company and may have some influence on the final decision.
Volkswagen also proposed cutting another 50,000 outside of Germany, with an undetermined number coming from their plants in China, where they continue to lose market share. Many employees in China work for a Chinese partner firm and are technically not VW employees. Between tariffs impacting the U.S. market and losing market share to Chinese auto manufacturers, both in China and outside of China, Volkswagen has its hands full. All of this on top of the years it has taken Volkswagen to recover from lying about emissions on its diesel vehicles. You know about that, Bill, as does a friend of mine who owned one. That disaster cost Volkswagen an estimated $38 billion in settlements. Even the former CEO paid a fine, though he avoided jail time.
As the largest automaker in Europe with multiple brands and a variety of models within each brand, Volkswagen faces difficult challenges. With fewer models and a reduction in total output, plant closings seem likely. At the same time, workers will have their say.
I'm guessing there will be retirements and that employees may choose to accept other jobs or some sort of package. The main point here is that unlike some other countries, employment in Germany is not a matter of you have a job one day and the next day tens of thousands of people don't. I do argue within myself about policies for keeping people on payrolls versus the argument that employees are simply changeable expenses. The reality is that many employment systems are set up to not value employees as important resources. C-suite executives, presumably adding tremendous value, draw paychecks big enough to build financial security. Stockholders reap rewards in the form of dividends and profits from sales of shares. But the ones who actually generate those profits, the workers, aren't adequately protected in the U.S., China, or South Korea. And even in Germany, worker rights are regularly challenged.
Employment is more than just a paycheck, something apparent in Germany and for those South Korean regular workers. Employment is about planning for the future, money for retirement, education funds for the next generation, and the ability to handle some of life's surprises. At-will employment ignores these important social values. Ask many American economists, and they will say that in the U.S., worker productivity, a measure of efficiency, is the engine of economic growth, and the U.S. has far more worker productivity than other countries. Of course, I would gladly exchange some efficiency for 4 weeks off in the summer without having to check my work email or being expected to take calls from the office. Nancy, let's look at worker productivity and worker output. Indeed, U.S. workers have the highest productivity in the world, producing about $96 in gross domestic product per hour. German workers are not far behind, producing about $87 in GDP per hour. South Korean workers produce about $54 in GDP. China is harder to track, especially with such a large percentage of transient, rural, and gig workers. One estimate put China worker productivity at about $20 in GDP per hour. The difference in the number of hours worked adds to the gap. The average U.S. worker works 1,805 hours per year. If we just divide that by 52 weeks, that's 35 hours per week. The average German worker works 1,330, which calculates out to be about 26 hours per week. These are the numbers economists and business leaders point to because they reflect economic output.
Bill, worker output is not worker pay. The average wage in the United States is $82,900, and in Germany is $69,400. While the U.S. worker produces more work per hour and works more hours, the German worker has a higher wage per hour, about $52 per hour compared to $46 per hour for the U.S. worker. The German worker gets a bigger slice of the output pie, while the U.S. worker gets treated like a cog in a machine. Want more productivity? Get a bigger cog. Charlie Chaplin certainly got that right in his movie Modern Times, where he portrays a worker getting caught in a factory system, moving repetitively and too fast. The German model values people, families, and communities. Workers have a shorter work week, longer vacations, a minimum of 20 days paid vacation, with many union contracts guaranteeing more, and they enjoy between 9 and 13 paid holidays. Germany also provides stronger parental and family leave.
So on average, U.S. workers make less per hour, but have higher average wages than German workers simply because they work 470 more hours per year. The U.S. workers' higher average wage then goes toward higher household expenses the German workers do not have, such as higher per-person healthcare costs, higher costs for education, and higher child care and elder costs. So what does the average U.S. worker get for 470 extra hours worked per year? Not much. They have less leisure time and family time, and the extra wage gets spent on overpriced quality of life services. So to summarize, compared to the average American worker, the average German worker earns more per hour, works fewer hours, has a guarantee of 4 weeks vacation or more, pays less for health care, education, childcare, and elder care.
It wasn't always this way. For nearly 3 decades after World War II, unionization served workers, their families, and their communities well. Unionized workers earn 10 to 20% more than non-unionized workers, have better health care and pension plans, superior paid leave, and more robust job protections. But starting in the 1980s, when President Reagan famously fired the unionized air traffic controllers, there has been a concerted and mostly successful effort to dismantle unions. More states adopted right-to-work laws. During Republican administrations, the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, the enforcement agency for labor, became almost hostile to union efforts to organize. And U.S. workers remain conflicted about joining unions. In the May 2024 election at the Mercedes-Benz U.S. International Factories in Vance and Bibb County, Alabama, workers defeated union representation in a 56% to 44% vote, with 2,642 voting against and 2,045 in favor of the United Auto Workers. Yet, employees at a Volkswagen factory in Chattanooga, Tennessee, overwhelmingly voted to join the United Auto Workers Union a month earlier. The union wound up getting 2,628 votes, or 73% of the ballots cast, compared with only 985 votes against. At all levels of government, politicians can be found who promote the notion of American individualism and disparage the benefits of unionization, despite the critical role unions played in creating America's middle class.
So in this AI world of hyper-global competition, what should workers and their employers think about?
Well, no matter which industrialized nation we have talked about today, there is tension between labor and capital. Owners want to make a product or provide a service in the most cost-effective way. Sometimes the most cost-effective way involves mechanization, automation, computerization, AI, and ultimately cutting jobs. That's an issue for the workers who depend on those jobs for their livelihoods. Management clearly needs the ability to manage, but management doesn't always understand the worker's perspective or even listen to workers. And sometimes managers are slow to realize changing environments And it is the workers who pay the price by losing their jobs. That's why I thought Germany looked so much better. With a supervisory board, workers have a voice. But at the end of the day, Volkswagen can't keep employees on the payroll if there aren't enough cars to manufacture. How do we strike that balance between having jobs and making a profit?
Well, President Trump said he would bring back a golden age of the economy. For example, he promised manufacturing jobs. Yes, America was once a huge engine of manufacturing. But what Trump didn't say is that much of today's manufacturing involves large-scale use of computers, robotics, and other kinds of automation, not people. Capital assisted by labor. I am not a Luddite, so I don't recommend taking an axe to machines, but we need policies that recognize that economies aren't static. They change, and people need jobs even in changing economies. Families and communities are an integral part of our social fiber.
So doesn't government have a role to play as well? An economy can't thrive without some reasonable legal guardrails. My apologies to the libertarians and ultra-conservatives out there, but a minimally tethered economy results in economic crack-ups. Just look at the recessions of 1873 and 1893, the Great Depression, and the recessions of 2001 and 2008, among others. At some point, politicians and business leaders need to realize that the economy must serve society, just as workers serve the economy. Those benefits German workers enjoy are mandated by German law, and the law reflects the belief that a decent existence is a core value to Germans. In the U.S., we treat most workers as little more than paper plates that can be disposed of when no longer needed. Let's think about what all of this means for the American workforce and our social fiber. American individualism isn't all it's cracked up to be. When it comes to pitting workers against workers in order to make a living.
I'm not sure, Nancy, that there is any one answer. Proposals have included shorter work weeks, universal basic income so that people can have at least a subsistence lifestyle in the absence of full-time employment, and more intensive human employment rather than the use of technology. I don't know if we can expect that any of these solutions will be adopted. I do think this is an important conversation to continue to have.
Know what I'd like to see, Bill? A serious conversation on Capitol Hill about these periodic workforce realignments and a national policy for helping those affected with transitioning through the economic hardship this causes. And we have yet to feel the full impact of AI on workers. When the government creates a program for people affected by economic dislocation, it reinforces our shared sense of community and assures workers that they and their families are valued.
I don't know if we can get that on the table given the atmosphere in Washington right now, but it's well worth thinking about. And maybe it would be the start of a much needed conversation about how we need a little less self-reliance and a little more worker solidarity. There truly is power in numbers.
We hope our podcast helps you think about these issues. Who has power, how they exercise that power, and how it impacts you and your community. When people talk about critical thinking, they mean a healthy skepticism when examining information. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. We welcome your comments, questions, and topic suggestions. Send your comments or questions to our email, asrb1776@gmail.com. That's asrb1776@gmail.com. And check us out on Substack.